Yeah, and if I can say, I'd rather prefer not to go out, but no, the globalization is one of the least unhappy subjects for me to talk about right now. But anyway, let's talk about where we are right now. A few points to make about globalization, global integration. First point to make is that the world is not flat. Apologies to my New York Times colleague, but there's no technological imperative that says that we have to have a tightly integrated global economy. Globalization does not have to move forwards. In fact, the world was a lot less globalized in 1950 than it had been in 1913. Political divisions, protectionism can very easily roll back the clock on globalization. We got a period of steadily falling barriers to international trade, increased a rules-based international order that left markets quite open. But that was not ever because economists won the argument. It's not the case that economists lectured politicians on David Ricardo and the virtues of free trade and convinced them. What happened instead was that we found mechanisms to harness special interests, to harness national security concerns in the interest of an open economy. And by we, I mean, at least initially, the United States, though increasingly over time, the EU became an important partner in that process. It was, if you like, the global order as it was, as to some extent still is, but may not last, is really one of enlightened mercantilism rather than a true commitment to free trade. That era is over. The only question is how hard the landing is. We are no longer, there are very unlikely to be any major new trade agreements. There's almost certainly going to be significant backsliding. There's going to be substantial economic nationalism, no matter what the political outcomes are in the near future, although how severe it will be depends a lot. Naturally, coming from where I do, I have a very U.S. focus, and God knows, and if anybody wants my views on the coming election, I abstain. I don't know anything that no one else, that lots of other people don't know better. But obviously, if it's a Trump victory, then the United States is going to turn the clock, not turn the clock back to 1950, but turn the clock back to the 19th century. We're going to just see a return of crude protectionism and a complete abdication of whatever role the United States has had in promoting globalization. However, even the Biden administration and Biden or some other Democrat holding the White House, what we're seeing is now a very significant shift towards a much more sophisticated form of economic nationalism. For pretty good reasons. That we have a lot of arguments here between Americans and, well, some economists, but particularly I find that Europeans kind of don't get it, don't understand why Biden, it doesn't, say comparative advantage is great, free trade is great, and just stop there. Well, there are actually really several good reasons for that. The first is that we learned a lot about the downsides of rapid globalization, or as I sometimes say, hyperglobalization and its discontents. We did have this very rapid growth in trade beginning in the 1980s, kind of stalling out around 2007. What we failed to appreciate, what I failed to appreciate, and I think almost everybody on the political scene failed to appreciate, was how disruptive that kind of rapid growth in trade can be. We focused a lot on what does it do to the overall level of inequality, what does it do to the Gini coefficient, and the answer was not much, but failed to see how disruptive it could be to individual communities. So if you ask what effect did imports from China have on overall U.S. wages, it's probably not a very big number. But that's not much consolation if you are someone who lives in a city in North Carolina that's devoted to the manufacture of furniture, and suddenly that industry disappears in the face of Chinese competition. And it turns out there was quite a lot of that. So the politics of trade turn out to be much more fraught than we realized, and that is really important. Any reasonable political leader needs to take that into account. Second thing is that there are things out there besides globalization, which arguably matter a lot more. So in the United States, one of the things that's at stake in this coming election is the United States has finally taken some real action on climate. It's not everything you'd want. It's not enough, but it's the first major move that we've made. And it's kind of a political miracle that we got even the climate policy we did. As you may know, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Holy Roman Empire of legislation, as in neither Holy nor Roman nor an empire. The Inflation Reduction Act had nothing to do with reducing inflation. It was primarily about promoting green energy. It passed the upper chamber, passed the U.S. Senate by a margin of 0 votes. Tied vote carried by the vice president. It but barely passed. And it was only possible to pass it because it contained a strong element of economic nationalism. It was only because there were a lot of Buy American provisions. And it will survive only because of those provisions, if it survives, because by the time that a future president says, oh, I want to get rid of this, by that time there will be battery factories in Georgia and electric car factories in Kentucky, and there will be interest groups there to defend the climate policy. And so that's just a realistic thing, something that has to be done. That's one major consideration. And in a way, it's in the same spirit as the way that we got this relatively open world order, which is that you don't yell at special interests and tell them that they should not be taken into account. We should only work for the common welfare. You try to harness special interest politics in the interests of the common good, and that's what we did. And if that does some damage to globalization, well, you don't want to be there 15 years from now and say, well, we cooked the planet, but we preserved the rules of the WTO, right? You have to do what you have to do. The last really important thing, I'd say the elephant in the room, but it's actually more the dragon in the room, is national security. Look, if we've here in Europe, you certainly know even more than we do that the world has turned out to be a more dangerous place than we had ever than we acknowledged. I don't think anyone a few years ago was thinking about large-scale conventional war as being something that would make a comeback, but it has. And the national security considerations are now loom really, really large in policy. Not across the board. Nobody cares about national security for the footwear industry, but we do care about it for semiconductors, for advanced computing, and it is necessary to have policies that take that into account. I mean, arguably, we even waited too long. If you want to think about a real economic nightmare for the global economy, think about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, just to be blunt. So much dependence on Taiwan-produced semiconductors. We're actually even legally kind of within our rights. If anybody actually ever reads the GATT, not recommended for light reading, but Article 21, at least as I read it, gives pretty much carte blanche to countries to do whatever they think is necessary to secure themselves, national security reasons. I'm taking a very U.S. perspective, but the EU is kind of, in many ways, the EU falls very short, as we just heard. You know, on defense issues, the EU doesn't nearly carry its weight. On trade issues, it more or less does. The EU does negotiate as a body on trade. In many ways, the EU and the United States are kind of co-equal partners on international trade. And the EU can play a role in managing this. We're going to have to move away from, we're not going to have the same kind of blanket, globalization is good, let's foster it, that we had before. We'll be lucky if we can hold on to the kind of sophisticated economic nationalism that the current U.S. administration is practicing. we can do this. It will help if we can kind of have an alliance to do so with friendly partners, and that very much includes the EU. If you want my vision of how we can make this work, it would be that we can maybe have a kind of reciprocity where things like subsidies that are motivated either by national security or by climate, that instead of being national, buy American, they can sort of be buy Western alliance, that they can be, that we can make a deal. But basically, if Europe can get itself together to have serious green policies, then the United States and Europe could make some reciprocity so that those policies serve special interests on both sides of the Atlantic. It's going to be very hard. And again, there's a very, very, very substantial risk that we're going to be turning into something much more primitive, that we're going to be in a world of all-out trade war. You know, I was going to say, you know, not 5 years from now, but maybe like 7 months from now. But hoping for the best, just realize that lecturing people about the importance of globalization and free trade is not good enough. You need to find a way to make this actually work in terms of the political economy.